We try to get the heritage learners to understand that not only is their language valid, it's good. They speak the language, the variety of the language that is used in their community. Their contributions are extremely valuable.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language,
Gláucia Silva follows up on her recent talk, Linguistic Perception and Production in Heritage Language.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. We have Dr. Gláucia Silva in the studio with us today. Dr. Silva recently gave a talk as part of our monthly LRC speaker series on heritage language, which you can watch on our website.
We will extend our conversations about linguistic perception and production and what language educators can do to best support heritage language speakers. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Gláucia.
Thank you so much, Sam and Angelica, for having me. It's a true honor.
Well, so before we get started digging into your talk, we always like to start the podcast by asking our guest about their background and path with languages. What's that for you?
Thank you, Sam. Well, my path with my background, I'm a native speaker of Brazilian Portuguese, and I started... Okay, so when I was about, 11, 12, it was fifth grade, we had French in school, which I loved, had tons of fun, but that only lasted 2 years. Then we switched to English. And then my parents at that time also sent me to an English language school, right, where we had classes either twice or 3 times a week for a couple hours or maybe an hour and a half. And so that's how I learned English, and my French stayed pretty much back there. Then I came to grad school after my undergrad in Brazil. I came to grad school in Iowa, so more English. But I also, in Iowa, I picked up Spanish, because I was one graduate TA in Portuguese, and all of my peers were in Spanish. And there were about, if I remember correctly, about 60 of them, 50, 60 of them.
Oh, my goodness,
yeah,
wow.
there were many. and so it was not very difficult to pick up a sister language.
Sure.
And at Iowa, I also went back to French, took a couple more French courses, and French has come and gone, and I've been at intermediate level French. Back in Brazil, about 40 years ago, I also took German.
Sehr schön.
But that did stay back there until last year when I picked up German on Duolingo because I tried a German class. It didn't work out because of, and it was over Zoom, so there's that.
Sure.
And then there was a complication with schedule and this and that and the other. But I'm hoping very much to find an online class that fits my schedule for German, of course, so I can go back to at least low intermediate in German.
There we go. It's good to have plans and aspirations.
Truly.
And what do you do now?
Now I am a professor in the Department of Portuguese and also in the department, in the education department at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And I don't like to say Department of Education because it sounds like the Department of Education of the the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Oh, or that, true. Absolutely. Wonderful. So you gave a talk about perception and production, specifically related to heritage language. What are some common perceptions or maybe misperceptions of heritage language speakers in our classrooms? So what is a heritage language speaker?
Thank you for that. I'm hoping to help shed light on heritage languages and heritage language speakers. So, a heritage language speaker is someone who normally, and that's the definition that we educators tend to adopt, somebody who grew up in a bilingual household or even a community, more broadly speaking. And these learners may be in any point of a very broad spectrum of proficiencies and fluencies and skills.
Sure.
Right? They tend to be able to understand spoken language more easily than they read. That's a tendency, right? They tend to be able to speak at least some basic sentences for basic communication. Some of them are quite fluent in spoken language. Many, certainly not all, may sound close to a monolingual, to a native speaker of the language, but again, certainly not all, right? In terms of their perception, there is a tendency, and we emphasize tendency, for them to think that their language is bad, it's broken. They call it slang. They don't think that they don't think that they speak it well, and they don't even think that their families know the language, that their native speaker parents or grandparents don't speak well. So there is this misconception of what it is to speak a language and speak it well. Right? Because the heritage learners are oftentimes not educated in their heritage language. So they associate speaking well with being educated in that language, which we know is not the same thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, true.
So there tends to be that perception.
Yep.
You discussed research on heritage language production that dispels some of the common misperceptions. What does the research say from the viewpoint of heritage speakers themselves, educators, and researchers?
Right. So educators and researchers tend to understand that those are misperceptions, right? And they value the contributions and the language that heritage learners bring to the classroom much more than they themselves do, than the bilingual heritage learners do. And now I'm going to speak of I'm going to insert myself in that group. We try to get the heritage learners to understand that not only is their language valid, it's good. They speak the language, the variety of the language that is used in their community.
Right.
So we try to bring that awareness to the classroom so that they understand that their contributions are extremely valuable, right? One thing that the research by Byram and colleagues uncovered was that educators, in their case, the educators that they surveyed, tended to be a bit more conservative in terms of code switching. Code switching is going from one language to another, or even from one register to another, but we can think of a heritage speaker of German in this country speaking German and switching to English for a little while for a sentence or two or part of a sentence and then going back to German. And they do that as a communication strategy. They will code switch between heritage speakers or within the community, even speaking with native speakers who have been exposed to English and understand English quite well. If they don't speak, at least they tend to understand it. And that practice, as research has shown in the past several years, that is not only a communication strategy, but it reveals deep knowledge, really, of the structure of both languages so that they can switch without breaking rules of either language. Right? But educators still, as a tendency, believe that code switching is a flaw, that that it means that learners aren't fluent in their heritage language. But that isn't true at all. Right. So we need to also work with educators to dispel that myth.
Yeah. So speaking of educators and thinking about classroom practices, we all know that in certain languages more so than others, you will have a mixed variety of proficiency levels, even in a first year level. Leave alone once you move up the proficiency ladder. What suggestions do you have for colleagues who find themselves faced with varying proficiency levels and varying groups? You might have heritage learners, you might have true beginners. How do you support and how do you recognize the proficiencies of all these various learners? What can educators do?
A lot.
Good. Let's hear it all.
Let's not go to all, but let's touch up on a few things.
Yes.
We can differentiate, and I will refer our listeners to Carol Tomlinson's original work on differentiation. I do want to emphasize that differentiating does not mean preparing 20 lesson plans if you have every day if you have 20 students, but it doesn't mean that you have to differentiate every single time either. But it does mean that you recognize that you have these differences in the classroom, and starting from your learning outcome. What do you want students to get from that particular lesson? You can think about how students X, students Y, and I'm grouping them in general groups because you can't really differentiate by one, right? So you're going to group them. So group X, group Y, and group Z, how would they be able to achieve that particular outcome? Because there are different paths. Not everybody gets there the same way. Just this morning, you told me, did you come up the trail? Right. And I said, no, I came up the road, and both would have ended up here.
Absolutely.
Right. So there are different paths. So we can differentiate, even if not all the time. We can have groups, both groups with heritage learners only and mixed groups, where in the mixed groups, learners will play up each other's strengths. Foreign language learners, our traditional monolingual language learners, right? They are native speakers of English in this country. They have not been exposed to language outside of the classroom.
Yeah.
They tend to know meta language. In other words, they tend to know the names of structures, the names of verb tenses, and what a preposition is, and that kind of thing, that heritage learners tend to not to know.
Yeah.
And that is very much part of academic academic meta language, right? So the traditional learners, the foreign language learners, also tend to develop writing perhaps more, I don't want to say more easily, but with less issue than those learners develop speaking
Right.
skills and listening skills. And they can pair with heritage learners and play up those strengths, whereas the heritage learners would contribute their knowledge of the language spoken in the community, words, lexicon, vocabulary, right? What they understand. They can contribute if there is, for example, a listening task that involves different abilities.
Right.
As we know, we can emphasize listening in an activity, but the activity won't involve only
Sure.
listening.
Yep.
It will involve other skills as well. So they can contribute their listening skills. They can contribute their speaking skills. So we can pair them up by heritage versus foreign language learners, but I would encourage everyone to also mix up
Absolutely.
those groups and also not to label them and not attach
Absolutely.
any kind of possible stigma to anybody.
Yep.
We don't want the heritage learners to think that their language isn't academic and therefore isn't good. And we don't want the foreign language learners to think that they have nothing to contribute because they are foreign language learners and these people understand so much more than I do. We don't want that. We want a classroom where we have learners.
Yep. Yep. I
Right.
like that.
So that was one thing. Another thing we can do. So Cajeda talked about two types of approaches, macro-based and micro-based. And we can think of macro-based as top-down and micro-based bottom-up. And she argues that the top-down approach would be used with heritage learners while the bottom-up with foreign language learners. And why top-down and bottom-up? Because at the top, you have your activity, you have your task, right? At the bottom, you have your vocabulary, your grammar, your language structure.
Right.
The heritage learners would go from the task, what are they doing, to the language that they need.
Yep.
Whereas the foreign language learners would go from the language that they need to achieve that task, right? And in terms of and marrying that with differentiation, one could develop an activity to help the heritage learners think about the task and then go about the language. And while you are working with foreign language learners on the structures that they're going to need to achieve that task, right? Finally, more recently, not so recently, but more recently, Diego Pasquale Cabo, with colleagues, has proposed that we redefine language teaching and in mixed classrooms do not think of foreign language instruction, which tends to be the case because we are trained in foreign languages instruction, not so much in heritage
Right.
language instruction. But what Pasquale Cavo and colleagues have emphasized is that if we use the language in the community, they work with Spanish, and of course there are many Spanish-speaking communities in the U.S. If heritage learners, we bring the heritage learners to the table, right? Contributing with their knowledge of the community, of the language spoken in the community, that this approach would increase motivation, for example, for both types of learners. It will broaden both linguistic and cultural horizons for both types of learners, right? So they call it redefining Spanish teaching and learning, and we can think of it as redefining language.
Sure, yeah.
More broadly, teaching and learning. And of course, one might ask, but what happens if where I teach, we have a few heritage learners, but we don't have a large community? Technology is around. We can reach communities.
Sure.
Right. There are communities that use just about every
Of course.
language
Yeah.
in the United States, and we can reach those communities.
You also stress the importance of context throughout your talk. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Thank you. Context is fundamental always, regardless of our public, right? We need to contextualize our lessons. We need to provide reasons for people to learn a language, to be excited about that language. So I will connect it to what I was just saying about the communities.
Yeah.
And what better context than the speakers in communities that are accessible, that are readily accessible to us.
Yeah.
Right? To bring teaching and learning alive. It goes from the realm of, let's imagine that we are in Berlin, to let's talk to these German speakers who are the next town over.
Absolutely.
And that will contextualize and bring it close to them. But of course, any activity that we develop, we want it to not be isolated, not to be just language practice, but actually be something that we do in context.
Yep. Great, thank you.
Gláucia, how can we best support heritage language learners in and outside the classroom?
Excellent question, Sam. Thank you. In the classroom, value their contributions. Their language is not wrong. It's simply a variety of the language. So they are correct. What they produce is right, even if it's not what a native speaker would say, even if it's not, and I will emphasize, a native monolingual speaker, somebody who lives somewhere where the language is socially dominant, right? So value their contributions. Outside of the classroom, encourage them, perhaps by nudging them through activities and tasks that they will have to produce in the classroom or for the class. Encourage them to access language, their heritage language, beyond their own community. Encourage them to be in contact with different varieties of the language, with different registers of the language. I said some time ago they tend to be able to understand spoken language. So, speaking of the many things we can do, project-based
Sure.
teaching and learning. And through projects, we can encourage heritage learners to go beyond the language that they are comfortable with, to go beyond their comfort zone.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, I think, how we can encourage them outside of the classroom. And once they get a little taste of that, maybe will stick with it. Oh, I can read this, or I can listen to that, or I can explore this music in
Right.
the country of my parents or my grandparents. Listen, there's this wonderful music genre that we don't
Right.
have here and I really identify with. And I'm thinking of the child of a very dear friend of mine who realized he really liked this genre in Brazil. And he then started to
Perfect.
listen to all of that.
Yeah, that's
right?
wonderful. Yeah, I love it. That's great. Well, Gláucia, we appreciate all the work that you do, all the support that you bring for all these heritage language learners and also the educators who work with them. What other projects are you working on, and where can our listeners find out more about you and your work?
I'm really not a big social media user.
That's fair.
Although I am on Instagram, where I only post for professionally related things. Gláucia UMD, GLAUCIA UMD. But shoot me an email, gsilva@umsd.edu. Current project. So my work with Cristiane Soares on grammatical gender in Portuguese and learner production of grammatical gender evolved to inclusiveness and non-binary language. We recently, about a little less than a year ago, our co-edited book on inclusiveness came out. It's published by Routledge, and currently we are looking at the perception of heritage learners who identify as non-binary
Interesting.
and how they perceive the use of non-binary forms, both in English and in Portuguese. So that is to come.
Wonderful. And I just want to point out that this book on non-binary language is award-winning.
Yes.
You did receive the
Thank you.
Publication of the Year Award 2024 by the American Organization of Teachers of Portuguese. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much.
Well, Gláucia, it's been delightful talking to you. Before we sign off, though, we'd like to ask you for a word in a language you love, are learning, want to learn, that makes you feel good. What's that word?
I could have so many in German, in French, in Spanish, but I will talk about a word in my native language that sends me back to my childhood. And it's an object. It's a peteca. And a peteca is a toy, and we play it by hitting it with the palm of our hands. It has feathers on the top, so it goes to our playing partner, right? And I love this object because it sends me back to my childhood. I used to play peteca a lot. But I also love the word peteca for different reasons. As a linguist, I love the fact that it has the three unaspirated stops, right? German has aspirated stops. English has aspirated stops. So, peteca, there you have it. And it is a word that comes from Tupi, an indigenous language in Brazil, which means to hit with the palm of your hand, which is exactly what we have to do to play peteca.
Wonderful.
Very cool.
I like that.
Yes.
Well, Gláucia, thank you so much for speaking of language with us today.
Thank you both so very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
We will be back next week with Clarman Fellow Olga Verlado, who will talk about language and power in the Middle East and beyond. Until then,
Auf Wiederhören.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
and follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.